Welcome to Driving the Line, the pursuit of safety, where we talk about the real issues out on the road, focus on safe driving, and learn industry best practices from your hosts Kenny Ray, Mike Bohan, and Jim Seibert, in the hopes that by driving the line, we get more drivers home safe and sound. This podcast was made possible by Marsh McLennan Agency.
Good day, everyone, and welcome to Driving the Line, the pursuit of safety. I'm Jim Seibert, and today, along with my friends and co-hosts Kenny Ray and Mike Bohan, we'll be discussing some ways how harvest season can add dangers to the truckers out there. Gents, pretty good topic here. It's going to be a great discussion. Before I catch your thoughts, I'd like to give you a couple statistics that I found from the Great Plains Center for Agricultural Health. Farm equipment crashes are not just a rural problem. 70% of crashes involving farm equipment occur in a rural zip code, while 30% occur in urban zip codes. 70% occurred on non-junctions on roadways, while 22% occurred at intersections. And these crashes are more likely to occur on high-speed roads. Those are roads that are over 50 mile per hour speed limits. Roads that have high traffic density, which average more than 361 motor vehicles per mile per day, and a lot of farm to market routes and roads with smaller lanes and smaller road widths. So, given what we know about 18-wheelers and given what we know about ag equipment, they're not getting smaller. And in many cases, ag equipment is getting a little bit faster to handle those roadways more. What thoughts you guys have on those stats right there?
I thought it was interesting, Jim. You mentioned that one stat that said how a lot of them happened on the roadway, not necessarily at intersections. And when I think about up in the territory I live in, up in rural northeast Missouri, we've got 4-lane road that runs north and south through the town I live in, but there's a lot of 2-lane highways and stuff around, and a lot of those close calls or accidents that I see happening, it's not at an intersection. It's a piece of farm equipment that's turning into a field road or something like that, and it's in the middle of the highway. And whether it's that left turn crash where the tractor's coming across, turning left and somebody's coming up behind them, they don't think that they're going to turn, or they think they're just getting over to let them by. And then we end up having a collision. The vehicle ends up rear-ending or hitting the side of that tractor or that farm equipment. So that was interesting to me. That's what I typically see out here. And I've never actually witnessed firsthand a vehicle have a crash with a piece of farm equipment. But I've seen some close calls, some near misses from that exact thing where people are just getting impatient, getting up behind that tractor and not knowing for sure what they're going to do or trying to get around them and having that crash. And it's just in the middle of the highway. It's not, it's not at an intersection where somebody's turning or something like that. It's just straight highway. And, the passenger vehicle is just impatient, wants to get around them. And up here, we've got a lot of hills and curves and things like that. So a lot of times there's not safe places to pass, and it's just one of those things of just being impatient. I saw something, and I can't recall the stat exactly, but it was, if you've got to follow a slow moving vehicle for just a few miles, because inevitably they're going to turn off somewhere, they're going to get out of your way. It's only going to take 6 to 10 minutes off of your trip. And that's like setting at 2 stoplights when you're running through the city or running through a town. So it's just be patient. There, wherever you're going, that piece of farm equipment's not going as far as you are. They will get out of your way at some point. So just be patient. And if you do need to get around them, look for that safe place to get around them.
Mike, that when you mentioned that left turn, boy, it brought back a memory for me as an old retired state trooper. I worked 2 bad crashes. One actually involved a farm tractor, and the other one was clearly agriculture in nature. There were 2 teenage boys that had a 1-ton truck, and they had a gooseneck trailer behind it. And they had, back when we still baled a lot of square bales of hay, and they'd been in the hayfield all day. And I don't know, they probably had maybe 100, 150 bales of hay on this flatbed trailer. and they were on a 2-lane farm market road in Texas, but that's a state maintained highway with a 60-mile-an-hour speed limit. And they were getting ready to turn into the location where the barn was, where they were going to put that load of hay. And the driver simply stopped. There was no shoulder on this road. It's a 2-lane road with no shoulder. And he simply stopped in the traffic lane. And the other boy got out and ran across and was opening the gate. There wasn't enough room there for him to pull in, which is a good reason for farmers and ranchers to recess their gates off of a main travel highway. Give a truck and a trailer room to get off the road. And this particular gate was right up at right up next to the highway, and he didn't have room to turn in there. So he just stopped. Now, again, teenage boys, inexperienced driver, but then an elderly man was coming along behind them. And this gooseneck trailer didn't have any lights. And it's in the middle of the day, but he didn't have any brake lights, didn't have any turn signals. He's just sitting there in the road. And that elderly man, we don't know exactly what happened because he was killed. The elderly man he hit that load of hay from the back at full height. He never hit a brake. There wasn't a single skid mark for me to measure out there. And neither one of the teenagers were hurt. But it was a fatality on that older man striking basically an immovable fixed object sitting there in the middle of the road. You know, that pickup wasn't moving. It was just stopped. And that elderly man just slammed into the back of it and was killed right there on the spot. And then the other one I worked, there was a feller moving a farm. I still remember it was Ford 8N tractor. He was going down the road he didn't have an implement at all behind it, just the tractor, and he was moving it. And he was on a 4-lane divided highway, not an interstate, but a U.S. highway. And a teenage girl, and this is all way before cell phones. So, I don't know that distraction played a part as much as inexperience. But a teenage girl came up behind him, and whether she was unable, she told me that she didn't realize as she lived. She told me she didn't realize how slow he was moving, but she hit him from behind, and there was no seat belts on that old Ford tractor, and it knocked the tractor driver off of the tractor, and she ran over him and killed him too. Mm-hmm. And just two horrible things that come back to mind of how the differences in speed and the differences in what farm and agricultural equipment has to do. And in Texas, and I'm sure it's like this in Missouri and Oklahoma as well, they're not allowed to be on the interstate, but there's no other highway that farm equipment's exempt from in Texas. I mean, we're a very agrarian and agricultural state, and we're proud and supporters of Texas agriculture. But just like, and here we are in the midsummer, we're in the middle of July, and, I'm thinking about harvest season, and I know y'all are both a little further north than I am. And basically the harvest starts at the Gulf Coast of the U.S. and moves north. You can always watch when the grain harvesters start moving north. But, we've started harvesting wheat in Texas, and that'll be followed by corn and by cotton and by rice. But we are smack dab in the middle of hay season. I mean, people are making hay. Most of it's round bales now, a little bit of square bales still going on. But we've got tractors that are moving around with hay balers behind them. We've got tractors moving around with hay rakes behind them. We have loads of hay coming out of the pasture and getting up on the road and having to stop and run back and close the gate. And so we just want our drivers that listen to the podcast to be aware when you're in these rural areas. And, basically every state in our country, even some of the smallest ones, have agricultural areas. So when you're outside of these large urban areas, you just need to be aware that at any time you may come up behind a piece of ag equipment, somebody moving a load of hay. Y'all know I live in the eastern third of Texas, and basically from East Texas all the way across the south, where, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and even up into the Carolinas is big timber country. And, we've got log trucks coming out of the woods that'll be weighing 95, 100,000 pounds on a 2-lane road. And they're coming out, and they got 12, 14 foot hanging off the back of pine logs. And they don't have to have mud flaps on the back of a pole trailer. And so if the woods are wet and he's coming out, he's putting mud on the road. So there's all kind of dangers that are associated with farm equipment and agricultural operations that are necessary operations. But we just want our commercial motor vehicle drivers to be well aware of those, be attentive, be respectful, just like our drivers want people to be respectful of them, and just watch out for this equipment that's moving around on the highways.
Yeah, you mentioned the type of road, and I see that I mentioned a little bit ago that there's a 4-lane highway that runs north and south where I live, and then everything else is just 2-lane roads, the blacktops, things like that. And we know that there's those hazards out on those blacktops of 2-lane roads because there's not a lot of room there. But I have seen on Highway 63, it's a 4-lane road, where you'll see a tractor or some kind of farm equipment that's running up and down the road, and they're over on the side, and people zone out. Maybe they're distracted, whatever. But this road's 75 mile an hour or 70 mile an hour. And people are running 75, 80 mile an hour. And if they get distracted and you've got a piece of farm equipment that's running 35, there's a huge, huge, huge risk of running into the back of that farm equipment if you're not paying attention. And that's one of those areas you would think that a 4-lane road, well, it's safer. There's another lane. You can get over and get around them easier. But it's, and I'm talking to the 4-wheelers out there right now too. You guys, we have to pay attention during harvest season because, the slow moving vehicles. I mean, if we see those signs on the back of those vehicles, those triangles, those emblems, that means we're traveling slow. We've got to recognize that. We got to keep our head up. We got to keep our eyes on the road and recognize that and get over, them safely. And I see that quite a bit. You wouldn't think that would be a problem on a 4-lane road, but it really is because people are just moving at a higher rate of speed. And unfortunately, there's a lot of distraction and things like that there on the road. But
boy, that gap closes quick, don't it?
Yeah, it does.
Coming up behind one. Ooh, son, it closes quick.
So you guys have said quite a bit to attempt to unpack here. And so while you were talking, I put together a few key bullets of points that I thought were really unique and important, and maybe for further discussion. Maybe not here, but maybe for our listeners with their staffers. Mike, you mentioned this ag equipment is probably not going far. You talked about the delay and associating that to maybe a 6-minute delay, a couple stop signs, stop lights, things of that nature. And I live in Oklahoma, but I am just a Nebraska kid. Born and raised, and my travels south in search of a Southern Belle took me to Oklahoma, and the state's taken me back a couple times, but we've traveled around in pursuit of our ag careers. But I grew up, I was born in Kearney, Nebraska, and that's right on Interstate 80. I was raised south of Kearney, and right there on Interstate 80, from the western part of the state to the eastern part of the state, you've got the Platte River Valley. And the Platte River Valley is nice and flat and corn. You're lucky if you see a few soybean fields, especially if you're driving on a country road. As I've traveled across the nation and been in the ag industry, I was pretty fortunate enough to have really nice straight gravel roads. When I say a mile by mile, that's what it was. Sections on a perfect mile as far as the eye could see. And when corn is planted, and the later on in the season, it creates some blind intersections. And an old running joke was, in the country, those stop signs, they can be, pretty subjective to the person driving on the road. Many wrecks happen at those intersections where, hey, stop signs, people just blow right through them. Nobody's coming, and it's blind and you can't see. Talking about those roads, and me comparing that road to what Mike was talking about earlier in Missouri. Missouri can get you sick if you got a bit of vertigo. The hills and the turning, and imagine coming around a turn that's relatively tight. You're going the speed limit, and before you know it, you are right up on the rear end of somebody. So stats that I didn't share is talking about that specific road design. And it's a comparison of curvature, the gradients of the road and the curvature of the road and the visibility of that road versus the number that happen on straight. And the number increases significantly when you can't see what you're coming up upon. And then Kenny, you talked about seasons, and I think that that's a great thing. There's a lot of initiatives out there, state by state, specifically in the heavier ag states, such as the Great Plains. You guys know that's the Great Plains rolling up into the mountains. That's where my heart is. That's where I'm from. But I would be one ignorant fellow to not know that the southeastern part of the country, Texas, you get to the Southwest, there is ag all across this nation. It's the driving force. We can feed the world. But our geographic location offsets many different crops, many different seasons. And I think that that's something for Kenny, you brought it up. I think it's something for our listeners to really take away from and add to their safety discussions and their planning. And when you start talking about those dispatchers, those guys on a long haul or gals that are on a long haul, hey, what are we likely to encounter? What's going on geographically per season and managing speed and space? And just a good discussion today. We're not far away from seeing some nurse tanks. And with those nurse tanks, if you've ever seen a truck going down the road, it's got one of them. They're hauling pretty good. But then they add two of them. They start a small serpentine. But I've seen 3 and 4 nurse tanks hooked up behind a pickup truck. And even though that truck is going dead center down their lane, those rear nurse tanks, they can get to serpentine. I don't know if that's a word, gents. Serpentining.
That is now.
That effect. It is real. And the end is whipping and it can cross the center line. And my dad always said, keep it between the mustard and the mayonnaise, right?
Yeah.
Well, that rear one has a mind of its own. And so I know that in the farming community, in the ag equipment community, there's been a special emphasis put on lighting of those vehicles, placement of those lights and those turn signals, and marking the reflective triangle. But we all know that stuff breaks off and they hit a tree or they hit a pole or they wrap up in a fence. Or you name it, that stuff breaks off. And that's not a number one priority all the time to be fixed and replaced. Sometimes we're lucky to even be able to make eye contact with the operator of that machine through the mirror or them looking over their shoulder. Left-hand turns are predominantly the moment where most of those crashes happen, and not being able to see a signal around a folded up piece of equipment. So there's a lot of information there and a lot of good practices and a lot of hazard recognition and sharing. And I appreciate that input today, gents. You guys have any closing comments as we wrap this one up for today?
You had mentioned there that I'd commented earlier that, a lot of times there's that farm equipment's not going very far. And most of the time it's not. But I remember years ago when I was still on the enforcement side, I knew a farming operation in Northeast Missouri that would go out into Kansas and do the wheat harvest circuit. And they had 8 to 10 huge John Deere tractors with grain carts, and they would take their combines out there and they would truck all this stuff down there to the beginning point of the wheat harvest, wherever they started. But then once they got those field harvested, it took so much time to load that equipment up on trailers and trucks and all that stuff and truck it. They just roaded that stuff to the next field. They didn't load it back up on trailers. So you had all these huge tractors and grain carts and combines in a convoy going from wheat field to wheat field doing this wheat harvest. So there are certain times when, you might be behind some equipment that's going for a ways because they may be going 100 miles. You just don't know depending on where you're at in the country. And that kind of goes back to what you were talking about earlier, Jim, in the different geographic locations of the state. There's a lot of ag going on, and it's all different, but it all involves the same big equipment, and the same tips for drivers are pertinent to each location. We need to practice patience. We need to just be patient when we're behind these. Leave them a lot of room. Just give them room, just like you would want a four-wheeler to give you room when you're driving a truck, tractor, and semi-trailer. Make sure that we understand what they're doing. We've talked about that left turn crash quite a bit, but, let's not get out on the left side of that vehicle unless we know for sure that they're staying in that lane or they're staying over to the right, because that happens so often. Because I know that Jim, you threw out a lot of stats there, but I pulled up some stats from the Iowa State University Extension and Outreach deal. Just the top 3 most common crashes with farm equipment. First one was left turn crashes. Then there was rear end crashes, and then the passing crash when somebody's just trying to get around a vehicle. So it's all of those crashes are, well, the middle one was, just coming up on them, probably going too fast, hitting them. But 2 of those are us in our truck, tractor, semi-trailers, or just our four-wheelers, just trying to get around that piece of farm equipment. So just be patient, leave them room, slow down, and know the signs. If you see that the lights that Jim was talking about, you see the triangles, you see the slow-moving vehicles, emblems on those vehicles, just know you need to get on a brake, slow down, don't get up on them close, give them room, and find a place to safely get by them. Never pass on a double yellow. Don't pass on curves and hills, things like that. You may think, well, they're moving slow, I can get around them quick. Don't take the chance. Okay.
Yep, absolutely. And Jim, when you were talking about those nurse tanks, we have not even introduced the idea of hazmat into this equation, but there's a lot of hazardous materials that are used in the agricultural industry. You're talking about those nurse tanks, and by far the most anhydrous ammonia, and there you have an inhalation hazard poison that's going down the road. A lot of the co-ops own big self-propelled spray rigs. Many times they'll have maybe a class 6 poison, an insecticide that they're fixing to put out on a field. You'll see, particularly down in Texas for our hay industry, you'll see you'll see fertilizer wagons going down the road, maybe pulled by a pickup, sometimes pulled by a tractor. Oftentimes those are class 5 oxidizers. So, we're mainly talking about the mechanical action of what happens in a crash, somebody hitting a piece of agricultural equipment. But if you happen to hit a piece of agricultural equipment that's also transporting hazmat, then you've just introduced an entire new hazard into that equation for everybody involved, the people driving the vehicles, first responders, and everybody else. So just one more reason to be real careful around this farm equipment. And I want to leave y'all with a little, I'll make this very brief, but kind of a humorous story. Didn't involve a crash. We were able to keep the crash from happening before it happened. But I got a call one time when I was in the highway patrol that there was a tractor stuck on a railroad. And I called the dispatch back. I said, did I hear that right? And they said, that's what the people claim. There's a tractor stuck on the railroad tracks. And so I had the dispatch go ahead and call the Union Pacific Railroad and say, if y'all got a train coming down that track, stop him somewhere. And I headed over to where it was. It was about 10 miles away from where I was. And I get to the closest grade crossing where the road crossed the railroad tracks, and I didn't see anything. And I was just fixing to call dispatch and say, well, it must be cleared. And I looked down the tracks, and sure enough, there is a tractor that is at the most awkward angle sitting on the railroad tracks. And so I called dispatch and I said, did you get hold of the railroad? And they said, yes, the trains are all stopped. So I couldn't drive down there. I just got out of my patrol car and start walking down the railroad tracks. Well, I get down there and this story gets progressively weirder. Not only is there a tractor sitting on the railroad tracks, he's high centered, and it was a 2-wheel drive tractor. He didn't have any propulsion on the front axle. So he was just stuck, but he's got a chain behind it, and hooked to the chain is a dead cow. And so the guy's there, and I walk up to him and I said, what's going on? And he starts to talk, and I held my hand up. I said, now, hang on. Let me tell you one thing. This story can only get worse if you don't tell me the truth. And he said, no, I'm going to tell you the truth. And he said, this cow died out in the pasture, and I was dragging the cow up on the railroad track. And I said, why were you going to do that? He said, well, if the train hits my cow, I can send them a letter and they pay me for my cow. So he was going to commit a fraudulent act, and ended up getting caught because his stupid tractor got stuck on the railroad track. Well, I finally got hold of the railroad police, and if people don't know, every railroad in the U.S. has their own law enforcement agency. And they went back and pulled their records, and lo and behold, their trains had hit cows at that location multiple times over the years. So every time this old man had a cow that would die, he would just drag it up on the railroad tracks, let the train hit it, send a claim letter to the railroad, and they'd cut him a check for a cow that died of natural causes. And his whole stem got revealed by the fact that he stuck his tractor on the railroad track. Now, fortunately, we were able to keep a collision from happening, but had we not called the railroad, or had someone not called in, we could have had a fatality right there, not of the cow, but of the train hitting a piece of farm equipment and killing a farmer. So I'll leave y'all with that weird story.
Appreciate you guys sharing that. Listeners, thanks for joining us today. In the next episode of Driving the Line, we're going to discuss Brake Safety Week. So until then, from my co-hosts Mike and Kenny, I'm Jim. Stay safe. Thanks for joining us on Driving the Line, the podcast that's always in the pursuit of safety.
That's all the time we have for this episode of Driving the Line, the Pursuit of Safety. We hope you enjoyed our discussion, and thank you for listening. You can rate, review, and subscribe to Driving the Line, the Pursuit of Safety on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or any other app you're using. You can also follow Marsh McLennan Agency on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. Until next time, thanks again for listening. Drive safely, everyone.